Here's a real curveball. My feeling for music left at the age of 60. And I didn't know what had happened to me until I was at the library. I was going through books on great musicians, and I pulled out this book, Interviews with Great Pianists, and in that, Claudio Arrau says, when I was 15 years old, I couldn't feel the music.
Kavan, welcome. It's been a while talking about doing this, but I'm happy you're here. But I want you to introduce yourself. If somebody said, say your name and where you're from and stuff, how do you start that out?
Yeah, so Kavan Rambukwelle, originally from Sri Lanka.
Right. Wow, that's a while. How long have you been in the States?
Since 1987.
87?
Yeah.
Wow, you were a boy then.
Yeah, you could say that. I came for college.
Really?
Yeah.
And where did you go to college?
Initially a tiny school in Philadelphia, and then I transferred to State University of New York at Purchase.
Oh, yeah?
And then Notre Dame, Indiana, and then UMass Amherst. And that's how I ended up in Massachusetts, or Taxachusetts.
Okay, so you're an educated guy, it sounds like.
I guess so.
I think so, but was that path all about music?
It was.
Okay. So what started you believing that you belonged in music? How did that beginning start with you?
Well, I was born, with musical talent, playing the piano at the age of 3 by ear.
Really?
And started the violin, I think, at 9.5 or 10. And my mother was a pianist. And so she would be the one, I would say, who kind of railroaded me down this path.
So how do you feel about it now? Do you think it's the right choice for you to spend your life in music?
Now, looking back in hindsight, I wish I had gone into engineering.
Well, now you're kidding me, right?
No, because I met, doctors, engineers. One of the best piano recitals I went to in West Hartford was really these doctors and engineers and lawyers, and the best pianist there was an insurance salesman. And I suddenly realized, my goodness, I could have been an engineer and still done music.
But the thing is that you obviously have harvested talent. Maybe you wouldn't have had talent as an engineer. Maybe that requires a little bit of something too.
Oh, well, that's a different issue
point. So I'm trying to give
you
the comfort that you may have just said that as a semi-joke, but actually you're here because I think you're one of the great talents and have shown it in the church, because that's where we met.
Thank you. Yeah. In fact, this engineer from Australia, when I was thinking about switching to engineering a few years ago, she told me, she said, well, if you have a passion for it, go for it, but you have to be willing to be pushed around by people in their early 20s who had much more experience than you.
Right.
And so I decided, I didn't want to be in that situation.
No, you don't. And they call that age, being
age discrimination and all.
Aged out of. And you did. Well, listen, to get ready, I've decided that I would make notes, and that's a new idea for me, because I've liked the idea that when we talked before, we talked a little bit about theory, and you said there is a theory, and I thought, well, there can't be a real theory about music because, as I put here, there is so many different kinds. How could it apply to all? Rap, rock, blues, classical, country. How can there be a theory that's overarching? Can you give us an idea?
Yes. The music is basically this expression of this energy that affects the sound waves. So when you mention all these different categories, that's just the left brain's way of categorizing different types of sound patterns. Because if you look jazz, rock, classical, I mean, what they're all doing is they're generating sound waves on an instrument or with the vocal cords.
Okay, I'll go for that.
But what separates a great musician, or rather real musician, say someone like Vladimir Horowitz or Louis Armstrong, and everyone else, is they could generate the energy that affects the sound waves. Same thing with acting. And I heard that Marlon Brando, for example, looked down on Hollywood. And when I mentioned this to Sri Lanka's best actress about Meryl Streep, for example, when I was 19 years old, I asked her, I said, what do you think about Meryl Streep? And I expected her to be all glowing. And she gave me a strange response. She said, acting is not imitating emotions. And I was puzzled. And when I came to America, I mentioned it to my acting friends. And they were all laughing in agreement with this lady. She actually came in Indiana Jones Temple of Doom in the beginning of the movie. She's one of my mother's friends. And my friends who have seen Meryl Streep on stage said that, yes, she's really talented at imitating emotions. It's like a bag of tricks she has. But she's unable to channel the character, the energy. And her colleague Philip Seymour Hoffman referred to himself as a fraud to a reporter before he died of a drug overdose. So when I saw that, I realized exactly what Philip Seymour Hoffman meant, because here's a real curveball. My feeling for music left at the age of 16. And I didn't know what had happened to me until I was at the library. I was going through books on great musicians, and I pulled out this book, Interviews with Great Pianists, and in that, Claudio Arau says, when I was 15 years old, I couldn't feel the music. And he said he went for psychotherapy, and 5 years later, the therapist removed his block. So then I knew, oh my God, that's what's happened to me. Because I lost the feeling overnight.
At 16?
At 16, lost the gift for music, interior design, landscaping, the fascination with gardening, astronomy, carpentry, all the gifts were gone. Bonsai, raising orchids, planting roses, all the creative gifts were gone. So when I came to America, one of my goals was I need to find a hypnotherapist or a therapist who can get rid of my block. So I tried hypnosis multiple times, it didn't work. I did go into the trances though, but the therapist couldn't remove the block. And then when I told my first US professor, violin professor, who was Galamian's assistant at Juilliard, Ishtak Perlman's teacher's assistant, I said, Mr. Lever, I can't feel the music, I can't feel the music. He said, welcome to the club, nobody plays like that anymore. So he was referring to people like Fritz Kreisler, and I hadn't even been exposed to that kind of playing, so I didn't know what it was until 1993.
Really?
When I heard the former concertmaster of the Boston Symphony, Mr. Borok, he had the gift of music. But he got the gift after an auto accident. So when I discovered that, from my stand partner, I told her, I need to get in touch with him to find out if this is true. And so I emailed him and I said, dear Mr. Borok, I don't know if you remember me, you coached my group, and so on and so forth. He said, oh, Kavan, of course I remember you, thank you for your superlative comments. So I said, is it true you couldn't feel music? He said, yes, that's correct. He said, I was always a good fiddler, but feeling music and all this artistic expression stuff, none of that, it was not my thing. And he said I was a late bloomer, but he didn't divulge the auto accident.
Well, you know, you're already surprising the heck out of me, because it means that your trip from Sri Lanka was partly an act of faith.
That's correct. So I had a lot of hope, thinking all these therapists will be able to put Humpty Dumpty together again. And I mean, after thousands of dollars, I would say, wasted, I realized, you know, the problem with therapy is they can rarely heal you. What therapy does is it gives you perspective. Right. And it helps you to kind of detach yourself from whatever the traumas are.
Right.
But it's extremely rare to hear of someone who's actually been healed from therapy, where the actual issue has been uprooted.
Right.
And so then I discovered more and more great musicians losing the gift for music. And one of the most dramatic was I was reading Edward Elgar's biography. And he said, I hate music. I don't want the term ever mentioned in my presence ever again. Oh. But Elgar, being a composer, that I kind of understood, because I had heard of writer's block.
This is Les Elgar.
No, Edward Elgar.
Edward Elgar.
Who wrote Pomp and Circumstance
I need a, you know, I'm shallow in this world. You're helping me.
Yes,
okay.
So but I knew in the writing world, it's well-known writers get writer's block.
Sure.
And they can't write for like decades.
Yeah, it's true.
So when Elgar said that, I understood it. But what most people don't realize is performing musicians and actors and dancers all get these creative blocks.
Oh.
And it's not talked about. And I mentioned this to one of these really advanced violinists, how I said I can't feel music. And he came for a violin lesson, and then the next day he's calls me from while he's driving on I-91 here.
Yeah.
And he said, Mr. Kavan, I was thinking about what you were saying, about you not feeling the music. And so I said, yes. He said, I realize most musicians don't feel the music. I said, you're correct.
Is this where you were saying to me that the way you're talking about it gets people a little crazy? Is this because they're worried about it? The theory is not including not remembering or knowing how?
No. Now, when I say I can't feel music, that doesn't bother them. It bothers some professional musicians, because then they suddenly realize, oh my God, we can't feel it either. And they are thinking, this guy plays like that and he says he can't feel music? Because I mentioned this to this very good saxophonist. I said, I'm seeing a therapist because I can't feel music. And he said, oh, what's your therapist's number? And he's taking my therapist's number. And yes, I mentioned Edward Elgar, and another person is Charles Ives.
Well, I know about Charles Ives. A friend of mine made a movie about him. He said, suck it up and accept a little dissonance like a man. So he didn't always look for melody, which was one of the things I had in my list to check with you.
Yeah. Now, Ives said, statement, he said, there'll never be music until the last professional musician is dead and gone forever. So I'm wondering if he probably heard someone like Pablo Casals and suddenly realized, well, no one can play like this. And these other musicians are kind of wasting their time. I'm wondering if that's what he meant, because he must have heard these tier one musicians like Casals.
Well, I think people are looking for their niche a lot. You know, like, how do I fit in? And he suddenly, if he's a dissonance genius, he's going to go with it. But I'm interested in the fact that in my research, it turns out that people can hear an octave as the same note, in a sense. It's just the vibrations are different. So they understand they've hit the right note, even though it's an octave one way or the other. Is this consistent with understanding? Because don't you need this understanding to know music? And if you hear that, aren't you hearing the music?
No, the hearing the music and feeling the music are different things.
Well, this is where I'm going.
Yeah. I mean, we can all hear music, unless we are like Beethoven. And then we are deaf physically, but not internally. Okay.
But when you say hear the music as opposed to, internally understand what you're hearing somehow.
No, I can. Another thing I need to clarify is when I say I can't feel the music, a lot of people assume I'm referring to phrasing. But what they fail to realize is, you have all these musicians who can phrase well. Yeah. And then that's mistaken for music. For example, Alfred Brendel can phrase perfectly on the piano. Yeah. But his piano recitals are like a Novocaine to the brain. It's so hellishly boring because he can't create the energy that travels through the sound like Horowitz could.
So what you're talking about is the feeling, is the energy.
The energy that affects the sound waves.
Affects the sound. And so as long as they can come up with the right energy.
That's correct. Another good example is Louis Armstrong. He had the world's worst voice. No vocal technique. Very weird musical phrasing. If you try to sing Louis Armstrong's music, you would never phrase it the way he's phrasing it. His phrasing makes no sense at all on recording. Okay. But everyone I've talked to who heard Louis Armstrong in live performance said that no one alive could sing like that today.
Right.
He really had this power to put a song across to the audience. So Louis Armstrong, I like to use him as an example because he epitomizes everything the music world does not idolize. World's worst voice, no vocal technique, you could even say unmusical phrasing, but the music is far greater than anyone alive today. Same thing with Fritz Kreisler. Fritz Kreisler on the violin, I was reading the biography, and France's best violinist, Zeno Francescatti at the time, he said the whole audience was the best string players in the world. And the minute Kreisler started playing, they all wanted to quit music. Now, this is the same experience I had when I heard Mr. Borak.
Okay, I understand that. Okay, let me try to follow up a little bit, because I think the word you haven't used is that when they get the energy, they're transmitting the emotion. Because I've done a little research that they're saying if you're a good performer, you have to know when you're creating emotion. Is that the same as the energy?
Within the ballpark, because there are a few musicians who can play with feeling. But what's happening is they are feeling the instinct for the phrase. My favorite violinist when I was a teenager was Ida Handel, and it was said that she wore her heart on her sleeve. And I did see her play live, and certainly playing like that is better than playing without that.
No, but I'm saying understand the emotion that they're sending out, let alone their own emotion. In other words, how is it affecting the audience?
When you hear someone like Mr. Borak, it's spellbinding. Right. And that's another important thing about the great musicians. You can't record them. So then I realized after I heard Mr. Borak, because I went and listened to his recordings, and that hypnotic energy is just not there on the recording. Then I understood why when these young kids listen to Heifetz and all, they find it very hard to understand why these people were so great, especially Chrysler.
Right.
And so getting back to Ida Handel, she played with a lot of passion, but it was not spellbinding like Mr. Borok. And so now Mr. Borok grabbed my violin and played on it during a master class. And this was in a Mexican mud hut called a casita in the hills of Taos, New Mexico. And there was no acoustics because of straw roof, mud walls, no accompaniment. And the minute he started playing, I literally felt electricity traveling up and down my spine, and I fell backwards into a chair behind. So I started to carefully analyze what the hell is this guy doing that is so spellbinding. And I realized, okay, it's coming through his vibrato. So he has a real vibrato. So then I realized, okay, that's the secret. But then later, even when he was tuning the violin and he was pressing on the strings, it was absolutely hypnotic. So only when I found my meditation teacher, George Boyd, in Los Angeles, California, did he finally unravel the mysteries of all this. This has to do with the superconscious mind and all these esoteric stuff.
Really?
Sometimes certain traumas, like an auto accident, can awaken aspects within our consciousness that come through the personality into the nervous system and go into like a musical instrument or speech, like in the case of Hitler, or Horowitz on the piano. So that's the creative, and that's what we want.
Okay, so
yes.
Where does your present practice fit into that? Because you're a teacher, you can't very well talk to your students the way you're talking right now. No, but at the same time, you in your own head have a different experience to share. So how do you feel about your place now, partly at the church, but also partly with your students?
Well, I do enjoy playing the instrument. Now that's different to feeling music. Now that's another thing a lot of musicians confuse. They confuse these kinesthetic feelings of playing their instruments with music. In reality, that has nothing to do with music, because when you can feel music, it causes you to forget the instrument. You literally lose consciousness of the piano or the violin. Wow. It's like on brief occasions when I have felt the music and I was playing the violin, it's like the weight of the violin is not there.
Really?
The bow arm feels like it's on a cloud.
Really?
But that's what happens when the energy of the music comes through.
Really?
So I felt it for a few seconds here and there.
Really. So you've mesmerized the church with your music.
Thank you.
They're delighted to have you there. But when you're doing it, you're entering in to the music. We see that.
Well, I'm trying to, but the problem is it feels like trying to squeeze water out of a rock because the block is there.
Yeah.
But however, I do enjoy playing the instrument, though. There is that physical enjoyment. And maybe that's what people are feeling.
Right.
You know.
Well, whatever it is, it's working. So in that whole thing, the rest of my notes just fell right by the thing, because I had notes about the fact that theory was made up of rhythm, melody, harmony, dynamics, timbre, and form, depending on who you read.
Yeah.
And the concepts are color, tone, duration, and all these things. But you're really saying that you get to a place where these are not any...
These are not relevant, because talking about that stuff is like talking about words in acting. I mean, like the vocal, the written word. I mean, that's the vehicle to express the character as an energy. And so what most actors do is they imitate the emotions of the character. And if they have a lot of acting talent, they can imitate the emotions really well and fool a lot of people, except other good actors who see through them like a CAT scan. Same thing happens in the music world. It's very easy to play for non-musicians or even average musicians. But you take any of these famous musicians, I mean, you take even a Yo-Yo Ma, he would never be able to fill a concert hall with, say, people like Lynn Harrell, because he has nothing to offer them other than a beautiful sound, nice phrasing, nice vibrato, nice good technique, which Lynn Harrell also has. So if Yo-Yo Ma wants to attract Lynn Harrell, he has to produce something more than that. He has to create the energy that affects the sound waves, like Pablo Casals.
Of course.
Then Lynn Harrell will be there in the concert hall. He'll break down the windows and doorposts to come hear him play.
Okay. I want to take it to a different direction because this is all too eye-opening. I hardly know how to respond, but I'm thinking this way. They say music is connected to health. They say music is something that everybody should share. And when I've said that we're in some sort of deep dive culturally, internationally, if they were smart, they would all, as leaders, turn to music as a bonding force cross-cultural.
Yes.
Am I being too big about music to say that?
No, if you have people like Horowitz today, they would unite people across all different swaths.
Right.
When Horowitz gave a concert, it was never advertised. And the notice of the concert would be given 24 hours before. And people would be camping out on the street in tents, trying to get tickets.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the thing is they are using Western music to teach kids violin in China, and there are very well-known violinists here going and helping, and they're doing it so that it does transcend borders, right? That's
in that
I'm saying.
sense it does, Yeah,
so we don't always just have Horowitz. Some other people can feel something special about Western music and maybe the exchange.
Oh, yeah, because you can always enjoy the composition on recordings.
It's genius.
But that's different from this creative thing that you experience when you hear like a Chrysler or Horowitz or Mr. Borok in my case.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it seems to me that I don't know how to. I don't think I prepared well for this, because I think that if you're talking to young people now who really, in a way, have taken the form and abused it as much as they've used it, and that can happen. So do you pick a certain thing to say, oh, classical has a special place, or rock, or what? Do you have a personal thing you listen to sometimes yourself?
No, but I mean, if a student complains to me and says, oh, but this is boring, why do I have to play this tune? I tell them, well, you're doing this tune because you're trying to gain certain skills. And I always tell them, focus on the non-musical benefits which are permanent, which is the growth of your brain, attention, awareness, short-term memory, long-term memory. You're also developing endurance for doing detailed work, which you'll be able to take to any other profession. And maybe when you have enough skill, you might be able to play some tunes you really like to play.
Got it.
And you might have some joy then.
Right. Well, this is, listen, Dennis, I think he wanted to take piano lessons at some point. I think that understanding what you're offering, there should be a line outside your door.
Yeah, and another thing is for older people, doing musical instruments gets rid of dementia, Alzheimer's. And I see that now in my mother who has dementia. She quit playing the piano, and now she's lost all those connections.
Really?
And she can't even play Twinkle, Twinkle on the piano.
well, this country's got to learn to play better than Twinkle Twinkle. You know, like we got to do better, but we're not committed enough to the kind of music that you're talking about.